Over the years, I have had the privilege to adjudicate cases that placed climate change at the very heart of the constitutional interpretation. And I think the jurisprudence produced by Supreme Court is perhaps one of the most progressive jurisprudence in perhaps globally on climate justice, and we should be really proud of that and proud of the court for that matter. What I share today is my judicial insight and my firm belief that law, science, governance, and justice must now walk hand in hand. It's very important. So I'm sure I missed out on very valuable sessions that must have taken place during the day, and I missed out on the inputs. We're all familiar with the challenges, and I'll just enumerate because the future depends on what we do in the present. It's very important. So we are facing a climate emergency, and I think that's the way we need to look at the whole issue. The super floods like 2022 displacing millions, accelerated glacier melt threatening water security, unrelenting heat waves and air pollution, monsoon unpredictability and agricultural stress. These are some major issues that we face. We contribute less than 1% of global emissions, but face some of the highest human and economic costs due to climate change. So this is not just about changing weather. This is about survival, about justice, and about our shared future. So solutions, what have we done so far and what have we been building so far? So Pakistan has laid an important policy foundation. So we have the National Climate Change Policy, the National Determined Contributions, the NDCs, the Adaptation Plan in progress is there. So efforts to mobilize climate finance and integrate climate into development planning. This is what I understand sitting in the court is going on at the executive level. But policy alone cannot protect people. That's very important. Policy alone cannot protect people. We need science, coordination, earlier action, and delivery to make these frameworks real. So who governs climate in Pakistan? And if you look at the institutional framework, we have the Ministry of Climate Change. I'm sure you've probably gone through this during the day, but I thought to build up to what I have to say, I wanted to highlight the institutions that are there in the landscape looking after climate change. So we have the Ministry of Climate Change and Environmental Coordination. We have the Pakistan Meteorological Department, the PMD. We have the NDMA and the PDMA. We have the private platforms like Weatherwalas and perhaps the Bakhabar Kisan. But despite the architecture, as we see it sitting in the court, despite the architecture, these institutions often work in isolation. And that's been a sad part that we see. When what we need is a synchronized resilience. And we can't possibly work in isolation, in silos, and synergy is required. And that's exactly the impression we get sitting in the court, that everybody is on his own and they don't seem to coordinate or gel. Just to highlight that there's been an amazing judicial leadership, a rights-based constitutional response to climate justice, which is truly something which is effective and something to talk about. So we've talked about making climate change or climate violations a fundamental right. We've even said climate finance is now a fundamental right. You do not have climate finance, you can't do anything about climate adaptation. You need the money to do a number of things. So there has been a progressive jurisprudence where we said nature has legal rights now. That is something we've also gone ahead and done. We've started developing commissions like the Climate Change Commission, building capacity with the government to achieve the climate change policy. So there's been some exciting work at the court. We've also come up with Islamic environmentalism, which is key. We started looking at the Quran and we thought 80% of the Quran talks about environmental values. And it was amazing to put all that literature into jurisprudence of this country. So we have the Islamic environmentalism, we have the entire concept of climate justice and the entire concept of environmental justice now a constitutional framework. We look at this issue on a constitutional plane, not at a statutory level, but at a constitutional level because fundamental rights are at stake. We were talking about media earlier and Talat Sahab was mentioning, I think our jurisprudence is not being communicated to the people. I think it was a very pertinent question when he asked whether at all the media is really fashioned to understand how to communicate what the judges are saying about climate change. I, with respect, would think we've done a lot more. It hasn't gone out to the public in that fashion. And I think media ought to look at those judgments. They really touch people of Pakistan, but it's not happening that way. And I would urge media to have a look at all that jurisprudence that we produced, but that's not the topic today. Just quickly, in my understanding on the bench, there's been 9 main pillars which could formulate a great strategy to deal with climate change. I'll just briefly mention those 9 pillars and move on to the actual subject today, which is climate science. I think Pakistan is far behind in the issue of climate science. And unless and until you have a handle on climate science, there is no way you can come up with a strategy on climate, because that is where the core knowledge which is required to deal with strategies or formulate strategies. But 9 pillars would be as follows, in my understanding. Number 1, first pillar, it requires a strong focus on adaptation. Pakistan needs to attend to adaptation and loss and damage ensuing, that vulnerable communities are not left to bear the burden of crisis they did not create. Mitigation is not our immediate issue, pillar number 1. Number 2, a robust, active and well-informed judiciary, and I may hasten to add an independent one also, if possible, is essential to endorse and actualize climate justice. We need to do that. Third pillar, ensure that climate finance is readily available, including innovative mechanisms such as Islamic climate finance. And you'll be surprised if you start looking at Islamic finance as if it was built for climate and environmental purposes. It is so geared towards climate and environmental protection, the Islamic finance concept, that we must think of climate Islamic financing as the way forward. Number 4, move towards nature finance. This is a growing area. Our banks and our institutions must start looking at nature finance, which is an area which needs to be considered. Number 5, which is perhaps the topic of today, understand and learn climate science to guide our decision making, ensure that policies are evidence-based and future-proof. That's essential. So science would be something that I'll be coming to in just a while. Number 6, climate diplomacy between countries of the global south. V20 is an example. We must build a cadre of people who could do climate diplomacy. You should see what Shahid Hussain Saab said earlier. If you go to COP, we don't have much of a thing to cut there, you see. We do not have a cadre in diplomacy to deal with the international arena. We just show up there and, that's not how you attend COPs. And especially COP 30 coming up, which is, I think, very critical. We need to have a cadre of diplomats, dealing with climate diplomats, I would call them, should be there to articulate what the crises are in Pakistan and what best could we get from that international forum. 7th, we must take charge of our own future, investing in homegrown solutions. I'll give you an example of a case that came to us a month back, and we've delivered the judgment now. They were setting up a small filtration plant in Lahore, and they had acquired, Wasa had acquired about 4,000 to 5,000 acres of land close to Ravi in order to avoid water going into, this dirty water going into River Ravi and polluting River Ravi. So a filtration plant had to be set up to stop or at least filter the water before it entered the river. Now, the case that reached us was after 30 years. For 30 years, the filtration plant had not been set up because the government could not get the international finance from the World Bank. For 30 years, they were just waiting, looking at the World Bank. When will we get the money? And you can just imagine all that water and all that sewage flowing into River Ravi for 30 years, waiting for funding. So that led us, and this is a part of the judgment that I'm quoting, where we said, come on. There, if you just even you go to Chat GPT, it tells you that there are homegrown solutions to water filtration, which are homegrown. And you don't have to wait for World Bank and the $1 billion, which will never come your way. So homegrown solutions, you know, to tailor and think about. That's one other suggestion. Number 8, climate accountability is essential. We need to have mechanisms established to prevent mismanagement and ensure that every dollar or rupee that comes serves the communities and ecosystems that need it most. So if we had this 33 billion loss due to the flood 22, if money is coming in, is it trickling down to the level that it's required? Or is it being used for, I don't want to say, other purposes? So climate accountability is another department we need to set up, because this is millions of dollars eventually need to flow in. Because if you're talking about global financing, we talk about millions of dollars coming our way one day. Or even if we were to go about setting up Islamic climate financing, there has to be an accountability. Does the money actually get to the people who require it? And 9th, climate courts. It's high time we had specialized courts on climate, because we need to have expeditious justice on climate issues. We need to also develop an ADR system dealing with climate-related issues, but that maybe some other day we talk more about it. So coming to the science part of it, the role of science is critical. A successful national climate strategy must be rooted in climate science. The study of long-term environmental patterns, risks, and forecasts. Without data, there is no way we can begin to come up with a strategy to talk about anything without credible data. So, climate science provides the evidence base for adaptation plans, legal arguments, disaster preparedness, and international negotiations. Without it, we are flying blind. And I really want to underline this. We see it in the court. We are just making statements. We do not have data. We need to really concentrate on climate science if you want to talk about loss and damage. Pakistan's major issue is loss and damage. You have to get funding from the international forum or develop your own funding, but you need to assess. The entire attribution mechanism works on data. So data is important, and so is science. So where does climate science come in Pakistan? Where do we look for it? So that now makes Weatherwalas perhaps the most important organization in the country. It says Pakistan Meteorological Department, PMD, if I could just use the term later on, which is the perhaps core. If you were to look at the scientific information that we can gather in Pakistan, PMD would carry perhaps the largest chunk of it, and anybody working with PMD would become extremely important. So even though PMD is there, it lacks in many ways. It lacks indigenous climate modeling. It has limited use of, I'm talking about the present PMD. It is limited use of AI, which is essential. You can't, no company can today, to my mind, work without AI. Cannot. And if you're not switching on to AI, you're going to be obsolete very soon. So PMD, out of all, which is looking at our entire data for climate in Pakistan, needs to move on to AI. There seems to be a limited use to it. This is my information from whatever materials that I've gathered. Weak in attribution science. Now, attribution science is absolutely important to attribute that this loss and damage is due to climate change. And that will make a proposal to go out to the world and get money for it. Because if we cannot explain to the international forum that this particular loss is attributed to climate change, you don't get any money for it. So the attribution science is an art. It's a subject which PMD needs to develop a skill in order to develop loss and damage modeling. So PMD is the most authoritative source for climate data in Pakistan, but not yet a climate research or policy science hub. We need to move PMD from a simple forecaster to a data intelligence agency. That is the future. If you can't move PMD in that direction, then we're not going to get there, actually. So our PMD cannot just forecast that there'll be rains and this and that. They have to move ahead. And I think Weatherwalas and other private sector partnerships could push that and give that impetus to PMD to get to that level. And I think that's why this partnership between the private sector players in weather have to get in touch with PMD very much. I also want to highlight that the Global Change Impact Studies Center which is the second source of science in Pakistan, called the GCISC, under the Ministry of Climate Change, once was a promising organization. I understand, I might be wrong, I understand it's gone stagnant over the years. It hasn't produced anything. So that's another sad thing, that such a dynamic organization, which was intended for Pakistan's climate modeling think tank, but it now lacks capacity, visibility, and influence. So we're lacking that. Once again, that sort of makes PMD far more important again. That we need to do something about PMD. Our universities and think tanks like LUMS, ComSats, NUST, SDPI, LEAD need to play a role, which they're not. Academia provides valuable thematic research, but there is no institutional mechanism to channel it into a national climate decision. I do not see LUMS or any university sitting on the table discussing a climate change strategy for Pakistan for COP30. We don't know where they are. They need to be putting in their part also. As I said, we're working in silos. Ministry of Climate Change is another organization which actually looks into climate, but needs to be strengthened with in-house science expertise or linked systematically with PMD. I think the ministry lacks, there is no scientific base in the ministry to argue anything. So that needs to be looked at very seriously, and by enriching and strengthening PMD, we're strengthening the ministry and as a result the nation to deal with this internationally. So PMD is to move from a weather forecaster to a climate intelligence agency is one basic point I want to bring home today. Unless we're moving that level, we're not really making a difference in the country. So the traditional meteorological department, the old paradigm, historically monitor weather conditions, provide short to medium range forecasts, issue warnings for extreme weather events, offer aviation and marine forecasts, support agriculture with seasonal outlooks. This is something we're doing. This is linear. This is gone. We need to move on. So the new paradigm, and I could suggest some, could be that the MD must evolve from, as I said, weather forecaster to climate intelligence agency. They need to move to climate modeling and attribution science. This is something whoever is here from PMD needs to please take note. You need to move to climate modeling and attribution science, disaster risk mapping and forecast-based finance, supporting ministries with climate data for planning and for policy and planning, quantifying loss and damage for global climate funds. There is no mechanism which can tell you that the floods in 2022, the cost was 33 billion. How have we assessed that amount? We have no idea. I don't know who's done that. But where is the national science which tells you that the loss was 33 billion? Warning people in the real time, especially vulnerable communities, collaborating with private sector, academia, media, and civil society, guiding courts and parliaments with scientific credibility. That is PMD's role for the future, and that I think is important if we were to build a partnership, because if PMD can't do it alone, then we need to have partnership with organizations like Weatherwalas and others who would bring in that tech and that kind of technology into PMD to refashion itself and rethink itself. This is happening internationally, and I think one model to study would be Japan, which is doing outstanding work in this area. Of course, US and UK are there also, but Japan heads the list, and I think we must study Japan and see how, with a private partnership, they've been moving ahead in this direction. Not my area, but I would very much want to study Japan in this area. So this has happened around in the world also, and we must look at the global experiences to that effect. So what Pakistan needs, and I just want to put a summary down, some points which are important to remember. Number one, a national climate science authority needs to be there, or a body like it has to be there, which PMD could assume that role, or any other body that the government would want to think of. A national climate science authority, perhaps a revamped GCISC or PMD could do this, but this is required. An integrated platform linking PMD, academia, and ministries is important. That platform would be important to develop any strategy for COP or for any national climate change policy. We must all be sitting on the same table. Open data frameworks to support policy, finance, and litigation. Climate attribution and modeling units need to be developed. a formal mandate for PMD to act as a scientific advisor to climate negotiations and proposals. I don't think PMD is even in a discussion when we talk about climate change policy. PMD needs to be sitting there, mainstreamed, looking into some policy issues of climate change. So building with the private sector, the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, has also said that you need to collaborate with private sector. And I think this is the forum where we're talking about that kind of a relationship. I think those partnerships are essential. We need to all come together to think of a strategy for Pakistan. So moving on, considering the time constraints on me also, so the last thing that I want to say is that we need to move from silos to synergy. A whole of society response is important. We must build a cross-sector alliance, telecom companies to send alerts, media to educate, banks and insurers to enable climate risk finance, academia and civil society to co-create solutions. Each actor holds a piece of the puzzle. Only together can we build climate resilience that is national, inclusive, and durable. A fragmented response will fail, but a united front can prepare, protect, and prevail. And so far, we've been on a fragmented path. We need to really move on to a more consolidated and uniform path. And lastly, to the Gen Z sitting here, the climate movement is theirs. You're the generation who's got to look after this. To the youth of Pakistan, this is not about your future, this is about your now. We must invest in climate fellowships, hackathons, and innovation labs, create youth seats at climate councils, support young researchers and entrepreneurs and advocates. Your creativity, data and fluency, and moral clarity is our greatest climate asset. And I think Gen Z has to really get involved, because you're going to be facing the climate change in future for a number of years. The age of youth, of activism, must become the age of youth leadership now. So final reflection, when a climate strikes, the poor bleeds first. Justice must move faster than the flood. Let us empower our meteorological department. Let us empower our meteorological department as a climate intelligence leader, embrace public-private synergy as a national priority, and build a climate movement that is cross-cutting, cross-generational, and rooted in care for this land. Because Pakistan cannot afford another season of silence. Thank you very much.